Hello. Thank you, Nina and Christine and Linda and Matt. It's an honor to speak with you today about two remarkable interdisciplinary projects, Spaceship Earth and the film subject Biosphere 2. It was serendipity when Hans Ulrich Obrist, the artistic director of the Serpentine Galleries, first learned of the film from Maya Hoffman and Stanley Buchtal, just as we were preparing to announce our project Back to Earth. Hans Ulrich also interviewed John Allen, the inventor of Biosphere 2, in 2014, and that's a great interview. I encourage you to find it online. There's such a clear synergy between Back to Earth and Spaceship Earth in terms of ecology and environmentalism. But what struck me about the film when I first watched it is how elegantly, Matt, you work across different ways of understanding Biosphere 2. One can focus on a story of scientific invention or artistic passion, or news media sensation, community organizing. Each of these stories are distinct yet interrelated. The way Spaceship Earth brings together so many different spheres of innovation is exactly how the Serpentine aims to bridge different worlds and audiences. So thank you for speaking with us tonight. And I'd like to begin by asking Matt, which story was it that first drew you to Biosphere 2?
Well, thanks for having us. And I'm glad there's synchronicity with what Serpentine is doing as well. And I find a lot of my ideas for films on the internet, just doing visual research online. And I came across this striking image of 8 people in bright red jumpsuits, including Linda, who just joined us. And I thought it was a still from a science fiction film. They were standing in front of, a glowing glass pyramid. And it didn't take me long to realize that, in fact, this structure was real and that these people had lived inside of it. And I was determined to tell their story. But as I kind of came into contact with those who participated in the Biosphere 2 experiment and conceived of it, I discovered this really fascinating prehistory about a countercultural group who had pursued adventures and all sorts of experiments around the world before synthesizing all of their experience and knowledge into Biosphere 2. And I thought the project had unfairly been rebuked as this sort of spectacular failure, but I thought with 30 years hindsight that there was a lot to reappraise about Biosphere 2 and its vision and ambition in the context of catastrophic climate change, which we all face right now.
Well, and connected to that prehistory, the group had so much focus on theater, gameplay, fantasy, escapism, absurdism, and it came out of this collective of botanists and ecologists. And I wondered if, as you said, society in the 90s kind of viewed this group very critically. And I wonder if you think this can be seen as a reflection of society's relationship to creativity.
Totally. Yeah, I haven't really heard it framed like that very much, but I do think people are quite skeptical about the insights of artists. I think, particularly in mainstream media, the theater group's title was Theater of All Possibilities. The Theater of All Possibilities in Good Morning America aren't really logical bedfellows. So in some senses, there was a theatrical dimension toward the design and presentation of Biosphere 2, and it entered the global stage of the mass media. But the project had a lot of different layers of intention and interest and design. Linda can speak quite eloquently towards the ecological intentions and the scientific objectives of the mission. There was also business aspirations to pioneer technology to colonize Mars. But I think it's always important to look at Biosphere 2 as an experiment in the broadest sense of the word. It was at once a scientific experiment informed by kind of rigorous research and observation and data collection. But it also in some ways was a human experiment conceived by people who pursued experimental theater and lived their lives as a sort of grand experiment. So there's a lot of things going on there, but I do think that it's true that when one enters a mainstream context, particularly on the global stage of the mass media, there's a lot of skepticism, and I think even people make fun of artists.
Well, as you said, in a sense, it comes down to people and the planet. And at the Serpentine, we're not only thinking about our focus on ecology in terms of the planet, but we think about ecology in terms of people. And Linda, I saw that you said in 1996 that personality clashes made life a nightmare in the biosphere. And I wonder, looking back on it now, how do you think about that experience living with 8 people, which is an ecology unto itself?
I don't feel like it was a personality clash. I think it was clashes between how we were going to manage our world. So even though the personalities might not have meshed well, we had a lot of training before we went in through theater as well as working in small groups so that the personalities wouldn't necessarily be the part of it. But what was a part of it was a decision of how to use our natural resources, just like on planet Earth. So that was what made things a nightmare. And maybe I'm rewriting the history and saying that, but I don't believe it was just the personalities that made it difficult.
What has it been like sharing this project with the world during the pandemic? I think The Guardian just said that, they can't imagine another film that had the spirit of lockdown more than this.
I mean, very unexpected. Obviously, we made this film and premiered this film before anybody could imagine something like a quarantine or a lockdown. But there is a kind of uncanny parallel. And I think, my sense of the material and what Linda and other biospherians told me is that being inside a kind of enclosed world is a transformative experience that reshifts your perspective on the outside world, which was referred to as Biosphere 1. So I think it's undeniable that we've all been transformed by the experience that we are having and have just had, and that there is really no return to normal. And Linda, I mean, do you think that's analogous to your experience with Biosphere 2?
To some extent, I think that right now we have a great opportunity to change the world, to have new ideas about how we would do things differently once we go back out as I guess a full-fledged community or society without having to stay home. Here in Arizona, of course, we're all kind of in lockdown still. And so we're trying to think about, okay, now when we're not in lockdown, what are we going to do differently? How are we going to behave differently? What's our relationship to the world right now? Inside of Biosphere 2, I didn't think of that so much because I was just changing as a matter of how I was inside an ecosystem. I saw so clearly how I was part of that ecosystem. And I think that was a little bit different than what I'm seeing right now. I see myself right now as part of a community that has to think about the future inside of Biosphere 2. I kind of felt like we were living the future.
I mean, and Matt, as a filmmaker, you've worked in the art world and as an artist, you've worked in the film world. I wonder how you feel the role of artists is changing in this conversation and responding to the environmental crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I do often look at subjects of my films as artists, even if they aren't. In this case, the Synergists, that group, were artists and identified as that. But I'm interested in people you could characterize as idiosyncratic visionaries. And I think a characteristic that I see in them that's common with artists is a desire to reimagine the world, as Linda was mentioning, and to speak a new language to do that, or to create a unique world with its own logic and its own terminology and aesthetic experience. And I see all of that in Biosphere 2, not just in terms of thinking about sustainability in the theoretical way, but actually literally reimagining a model world and to band together to make that world self-sustaining. So I think, like, in terms of the artist's role and thinking about environmental sustainability, it continues to go back to this impulse to reimagine the world on new terms. And I think another thing that's part of the necessary conversation right now is that I don't think sustainability is viable without equity. And that more and more, it's not about thinking about environmentalism separate from issues of racial justice or economic justice, but that for us to continue living in a sustainable way during these precarious times, artists and producers of culture, as well as environmentalists and activists, all have to find connections between sustainability and equity.
When we were building the biosphere, we had a lot of different scientists working to create a total system. And so I had the pleasure of working with a person who was the main designer of a biome. For instance, Sir Gillian Prance was our biome design captain for the rainforest. And I always thought that it would be wonderful for people to want to have an original Prance, as one would have an original Degas, or an original this, original that, or an original Tony Burgess, who is our designer of the desert, because he did such a beautiful job at bringing together all of the pieces through his own observation. And I think a lot of what artists and scientists do is the same thing, and it comes from the same place. And I've thought that for a very long time, having spent a lot of time with artists, hiking around outside and talking about it.
In John Allen's interview with Hans Ulrich, he talks about how Bucky Fuller taught him about this idea of total systems, which you just mentioned. And I think the title of the film is taken from a book by Bucky Fuller. I wondered if there are any other references too.
Yeah, I was definitely inspired by Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, the countercultural tome that Buckminster Fuller published. And he had the idea of synergy and a book called Synergetics. And that was the inspiration for the group who conceived of Biosphere 2. They called themselves synergists. Their commune was called Synergia Ranch. And they had a geodesic dome, that signature design element conceived by Buckminster Fuller, as the sort of nucleus of their ranch. And Kathleen Gray, one of the members of the Synergists, speaks pretty clearly about how the geodesics of a geodesic dome are analogous for their philosophy, in which the whole is stronger than the sum of its part. No, is it? The whole is stronger than the sum of its parts. All of these individuals working together create a larger whole, and the synergy amongst those pieces, is magnificent. And so that was obviously part of the inspiration for the design of Biosphere 2, which uses geodesics, but it's also an idea about small groups, which I left the project thinking about small groups as viable models for realizing unprecedented projects. So it's not so much about the genius of the individual as it is about groups of people sharing common goals and using their varied skills to achieve really extraordinary things. But at the same time, Spaceship Earth is a reference to the Epcot amusement ride. Itself is a kind of cartoonish geodesic dome with animatronic vignettes that show the history of civilization and point toward the future. And I think part of what's so intriguing about Biosphere 2 is there's this potent mix of countercultural idealism, rigorous science, but also kind of theme park theatrics. And all of that is what makes it such an unusual and kind of alluring project.
And Matt, you've in the past talked about how your team in making Spaceship Earth became one of these synergetic projects where you really saw the whole becoming so much more than the sum of the parts. I love that.
Yeah, and also our filmmaking process took 2 years. So it was also like the Biosphere 2 mission. But yeah, I mean, I really do think it's an important model to look at. I think broad consensus right now, more than ever, it's very clear that broad consensus is not viable. But that people doing transformative projects on a smaller scale is. I think what Linda does in Oracle, Arizona, where she lives, just 10 minutes from Biosphere 2, is a great example of that. She's really focused on building a community learning garden in this community, in this small rural town. And it's, I think, the same philosophies, the same point of view and energy operating on a smaller scale with that community group is just as meaningful as the group of 8 people who lived and built an entire model of our whole Earth's ecosystem.
I feel the same way. Thank you very much for saying that. And what I really love about this smaller project, the Community Learning Garden, is that the community now owns it. So the whole community has come together and formed that synergy to create something that no individual would have created. In fact, that's what got me to the biosphere in the first place, was the team of people working together towards a common goal. It didn't really have to be a biosphere. When I first met the people in 1985, they just wanted me to teach them how to build greenhouses and grow plants. But I became so attracted to the fact that this was really a magnetic center for people who wanted to work together towards a common goal.
And the biospheres worked as a commune and a corporation. Has that affected the way that you've approached the garden? And do you think this model is relevant today?
Yeah, very much so. The name of the company originally that built Biosphere 2 was Space Biospheres Ventures. So the interest was in how we could live in space off of the Earth, that we could learn about how a biosphere works, how does our world work, and a venture, and that we'd be able to make a profit from doing some of the things that we were doing. And it's very much the same thing in our community garden, though we don't have a focus on space. We certainly are trying to learn how the Earth works by creating a huge microbial mat in the soils and making a total system and attracting pollinators and so forth. But ventures, we definitely have to do things in order to be able to support the community garden. We're not going to live on public funding or grants forever. So we've started working on some projects that will have a return, a financial return to the garden, to help it keep going. Very similar model.
And that model is part of what interested me in the synergists. In so many ways, they distinguish themselves from the hippie back to the land movement of the 1970s by pursuing enterprises that were backed almost primarily by a Texas oil man at Bass. And this model of economic sustainability mixed with ecological sustainability, I think, was in many respects ahead of its time. But in a lot of ways, I made the film to be a cautionary tale about the limitations of working in this conscious capitalism, to use a buzz term of the moment. Because ultimately it was forces of capitalism and politics that led towards the dismantling of the project that was as it was conceived to be. So, oftentimes profit isn't the best bedfellow with idealism, even though that model of conscious capitalism is being espoused widely these days.
Another venture that John Allen and the Synergists did was October Gallery, which is actually in London. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I don't know tons about October Gallery, but the Synergists built an enormous concrete ship called the research vessel Heraclitus. And they traveled around the world starting different ecological and cultural projects, from a hotel in Kathmandu to thousands of acres of Australian grasslands in the outback to an art gallery in a city center in London. And that gallery is still there. And one of the things that was unique about October Gallery and continues to be is that they showed global artists, artists who at the period would often be regarded as outsider artists, but whom they contextualized under the broader guise of contemporary art. And they also provided a context for artists such as William Burroughs and Brian Geisen, bringing a kind of counterculture sensibility together with a global perspective on the arts and kind of abolishing terms like outsiders. And so they very much kind of occupied a peripheral space within the art world, but always were thinking about intersections between, global ecology and the avant-garde. And that is a strain of Biosphere 2 that's often overlooked or not understood, and October Gallery was an important epicenter of that activity. There's a cat in our session.
Yeah, I forgot to close the door.
The British Ghanaian photographer James Barner, whose work will be the focus of a solo exhibition at the galleries next spring, actually had a show at October Gallery. Linda, I wonder, when you were in the Biosphere, did you talk about art?
Yes, we talked about art a lot. In fact, part of what we did was we did interactive interbiospheric art shows. So we were able to link up, not as easily as we do now on Zoom, because this was 1991, 1992, 1993. So it was a little bit clunky, but we could do so through either video or satellite uplinks. And we met with people and we would play our music and they would play their music, and we would read our poetry and they would read their poetry. So we had the first interbiospheric art show from inside of the biosphere. We also, there's a lot of things you could do if you're isolated like that. Of course, work took a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to make a world work. But we also we studied different musicians, and Roy Walford took us through a lot of different musicians. We would read certain books and have discussions about the books on Thursday evenings. That was our Thursday evening thing that we did all together. Some people painted, although they weren't allowed to bring in anything that would off-gas, anything that would be dangerous, because we were in a closed system and you didn't want to have everybody susceptible to what that might cause. So yeah, all of us did something, whether it was writing or visual arts or performance art inside the biosphere. Mm-hmm.
And I always looked at Roy Walford, his videography inside, which you see in the film, which really shows you what life inside Biosphere 2 is like. It almost feels like video art to me. And he was a video artist. He made music videos inside and did all sorts of video experiments that he wrangled the Biosphereans into. And, he was in a relationship, collaborative and romantic, with the amazing artist Barbara T. Smith. And she and him collaborated on a project called 21st Century Odyssey, in which she outside would do kind of journey-oriented performances, and through primitive video technology and video conferencing, they'd communicate with each other on the inside and the outside. So they were engaged in a kind of prolonged 2-year experimental art project themselves, while he was shooting video inside, both to make a documentary, but with the sensibility of a video artist.
And so there were a lot of external forces that were kind of infiltrating the inside. I wonder if you could talk about the impact of the media and the press, and what was the impact of that when you were inside the biosphere?
Well, we had some training initially from a person who's a professional trainer for people who are going to be in the public eye a lot. And this trainer said, you should weigh all of your press releases. You don't have to read them, just weigh them, because the important thing is what you're doing is getting out there so people know what you're doing. Whether it's positive and negative didn't matter so much. Sometimes information would come back to us of what was happening in the press, and it was really disconcerting and distressing for a short period of time. But then we'd have to get back to our work, because after all, we were trying to make this world work around us. Once I remember I think it was Mark Cooper at the Village Voice, said that we were all going to explode because the carbon dioxide levels in our blood would get so high that we would explode. And, that's the kind of thing you can only laugh at. So sometimes people would come from the outside and show these newspapers to us through the glass. There wasn't a really good way to get them in electronically, because email wasn't very well developed back then. So we'd look at these, and some of them, they were just really funny to laugh at, to think that people would really think that that would happen. So sometimes it impacted us in making us sad. Sometimes it impacted us by making us laugh. But for the most part, we were so focused on what we were doing that effectively it really didn't matter what was happening outside of Biosphere 2, as long as we were able to stay inside and do our work.
Matt, you deal with archives so often in your work as materials, archives as subjects, sometimes both. Can you talk about the process of working with the archival material that was collected about Biosphere 2?
Yeah, it was a really unprecedented experience for me because this is a really Byzantine story with so many twists and turns, and it unfolds over literally half a century. And there was archival footage to cover every single beat of that story, and that just doesn't ever happen. And when I went to Synergia Ranch, I was brought into this temperature controlled closet that had hundreds of 16 millimeter film canisters and analog videotapes and thousands of images and slides. And it was astonishing. This group, who's mostly been overlooked and discounted in the media, had just meticulously documented everything they had done since they coalesced in the 1960s. And they had a certain, and continue to have a certain kind of confidence that what they were doing was historically significant and they had to document it. So to be given the opportunity to work with that material that had basically been untapped was extraordinary, and it's a big responsibility. And then, of course, Roy Walford had left behind hundreds of hours of this video footage we were discussing that he shot inside. So, every time I make a film like this, we had 600 hours of footage, which sounds unbelievable to people, but it's kind of normal for me in my form of filmmaking. And again, small groups. We had a really great team of story producers, an associate editor, our editor, and myself, who created a Dewey Decimal System and indexed the entire collection, and then ingested and digitized material, screened it, organized by topic, and creating greatest hits. And as we were cutting together the film, the story producers would look for material. So, what I like to say is it's really collaborative to deal with enormous archives, particularly private archives that haven't previously been mined. And that it's one thing to find things that literally illustrate what's being discussed. It's another thing to find things with a kind of metaphorical significance. So one of my favorite shots in the film is a 16 millimeter shot where the group of synergists run up a staircase that has nothing on, it's a staircase to nowhere. And one of the things in the film is they come together around this avant-garde novella called Mount Analog by René Dumas. And it's a book about a group of people who go on an adventure to an island that doesn't exist on a map. So this shot of them running up the staircase felt so heavy and significant to me. And most people won't notice it, but I think some people probably do. But that's just travelogue footage from one of their adventures to some Mayan ruins or whatnot, or in India, I'm not sure. But it takes the eye of a storyteller within the collaborative group of my team to spot that shot and to realize that this is a shot about our story. It's not just people on a vacation.
I want to quickly remind viewers that if you have questions, you could submit them in the chat. We're going to be giving you an opportunity to ask in a minute. I wanted to talk about the issues faced and addressed by the Biosphere 2 project and our current socio-political and ecological climate, which you've touched on, themes of community and of isolation, concern over our impact on the earth, media skepticism around environmental science. The list goes on. What lasting impression do you hope that people take away from watching this film?
Well, I hope they take away the importance of every single individual in the way that we interact with the planet. So every person is not just a little tiny pea in a pea pod. Everybody has a big impact on the earth, and we can choose, is it going to be positive or is it going to be negative? So that's the thing that I really want to, and the thing I like to talk about in terms of how I changed was just an incident that happened when I came out of the biosphere. And I was in a dentist's office because it was time to go to the dentist. I had not been to one in over 2 years. And I sat in the dentist chair, and the dentist was out of the room, but there were some other people in there. And all of a sudden, I just panicked. And I said, "Where does your oxygen come from?" Because there are no plants in the room. And I'd gotten so used to the connection, my personal connection with carbon dioxide going into the plant and the plant producing the oxygen, that if I didn't see plants, it was just outrageous. So there was that like just quick snap moment, where you think a different thought than you might have realized. Of course, on Earth, we're connected to a much larger biosphere, but that didn't enter my head. It just, there was nothing there. Where's my oxygen coming from? So I would love it if everyone on Earth felt that way. So they could at least grow one little plant in their apartment or in their home and love that one little plant and think about that every day.
And for me, I think I have never attempted to make an inspiring film. That's not really what drives me as a filmmaker and artist, is to inspire people. It's just not my interest. But as I was making the film, I found myself getting very inspired, particularly when I first saw the archival footage of the Heraclitus ship taking off. It was this group of people who had this wild idea to become planetary by building an enormous ship, and they had none of the technical skills to do it. They somehow managed to build an enormous ship, and it launched, and it actually took off and sailed around the world and still exists today. That was just inspiring. I cried the first time I saw that footage. And as I grappled with the material, I thought, this is, an inspiring story. It really had been discounted as a failure. And that really struck me as a very cynical way to look at the world. And I had no interest in recapitulating that kind of cynicism, but I recognized an inspiring dimension to the story, and I wanted to share that, because we live in a culture in which people discourse quite a bit. People are very critical of each other, and critique is at the center of people's discussion of the ills in the world. And we need more doing. We need more people, and artists are very much these types of people who do things, who have ideas that not only they discuss and express, but that manifest in tangible projects that they realize. And regardless of the success or alleged failure of BIOSPHERE 2, it is extraordinary that a group of people had such a wild idea and pursued it and built it. And that we need more impulses and more activity like that. And we're presented with a new opportunity to do things that haven't been done before in the world.
There was such a moment of ecstasy when the ship sailed. Is that moment you described for you having this realization? Has that been the high point of this journey, or do you think it's still to come?
I mean, I would say whenever I make a film, it's driven by an impulse that this is going to be a good film. I don't necessarily know why I'm the person to make it or why I want to. It's rare that that's crystal clear to me. It's just kind of hazy. And I would say in the filmmaking process, I'm often looking to understand why me, why am I interested? I try to find myself in the material, and it's more of an emotional process. It's kind of like when I have an emotional response to materials, when I kind of find my own entry point. And certainly the ship for me was that moment where I recognized, where I saw my interest in the material. And it's been interesting discussing the film and hearing reactions to it and framing it around a world that's transforming on a week-to-week, if not day-to-day basis. I really think the whole question of a quarantine and how that affects people and affects our understanding of the world has been really interesting to discuss. But I brought this issue up before. I think, unwittingly, the biospherians and the synergists created a model society. It was a human experiment in BIOSPHERE 2 as much as it was an ecological experiment. And that some of the issues that transpired interpersonally or in terms of management and communication, those are political issues that we face today. And I think, again, that if we are going to reinvent a new world, it can't just be ecologically sustainable, but we can't replicate the systems of power and decision-making that already exist. We have to intertwine ecological sustainability with equity. So in light of the kind of racial justice uprisings around the world, that's been another dimension of my thinking about the project. So it's always interesting to make something based in reality and for the meaning of that to continue to transform as the world itself evolves. And it's just such a crazy moment in history. So it's been so interesting to put out a film and to see how its significance shifts.
The Serpentine is through our project Back to Earth, working with artists on campaigns for the environment. We've partnered with the Eden Project, an educational charity in Cornwall, whose massive biomes house the largest rainforest in captivity. It's so amazing, Linda, to hear about your garden. I wonder if there are any other organizations or examples of projects that have learned or gone on from BIOSPHERE 2 that you'd like to talk about.
Well, I think just the work that the other biospherians are doing now is something I would like to talk about, because we're all continuing our work on Earth to try and learn how the Earth works, to try and figure out how can we actually live on Earth, in a very peaceful way. And so we have three of the people who are working with coral reefs, and not just with coral reefs, but with the reason that coral reefs are dying. Part of which is agriculture and fertilizers going into the ocean. So Sally, Laser, and Gay are all working on those kinds of issues. Mark Nelson, of course, is working with the Institute of Ecotechnics and organic gardening, and also waste recycling systems around the world are some of the things that he's working on. And of course, Roy is no longer with us, but the work that he did on nutrition and the impact of nutrient-dense, low-fat, low-calorie diets on the aging process was a really important thing, and is still contemporary. So I think those are things to look at, some of the projects that are already being worked on with some of my biospherian friends. Of course, community gardens are happening now all over the world. In London, of course, you've got allotments, and they've been there for a long time. I think maybe there's a switchover now to look at a total system, not just a garden with plants coming up to eat, but a garden that nurtures the soil, that puts oxygen back into the atmosphere, attracts pollinators and keeps our pollinator systems going. So it's no longer just a garden where you grow some kale. It's a garden where you grow the total ecosystem. And I'm seeing that happening all over the world. We don't just have an orchard in our community learning garden. We have a food forest. So it starts out with trees that are going to produce food for people to eat and for wildlife to eat. But below that, there'll be several layers, as well as vines, as there would be in a forest. So it'll be a great habitat for wildlife as well as food. So many things are happening right now on a smaller scale, and I hope that continues, because I think that people are learning a lot from each other and a lot from the earth in doing these small scale projects.
I'm going to ask the last question, which is, we have two questions. One is from Andrew, who'd like to know how relevant this documentary is to the current global situation, and could we learn something from Spaceship Earth about how to deal with the pandemic?
Well, I think this is a quaint prelude towards the effects of catastrophic climate change. I hate to think about it, but I really think it's true. And there has to be both an individual and a monumental transformation. And I think the film shows that people need to think both on very small scales, but on monumental scales as well, about personal transformation as it relates towards our collective responsibility to protect the planet. So in some ways, by a group of people coming together to protect a miniature world and to overcome their differences and media scrutiny and ecological calamities inside, and to stick together, to work together to protect that earth. I mean, that is truly what we have to do now. And I think Mark Nelson puts it often he fell in love with the biosphere. And we all, in some ways, need to now fall in love with our biosphere. So I hope the film conveys that to some extent.
So now really the last question, which is a combination of a question from Julia and from Hans Ulrich Obrist, who is keen to find out if you could tell us a little bit more about your unrealized projects.
Who, me or Linda?
Both of you.
Oh, okay. I have one, and it's, again, a community scale project where the town of Oracle is about 3,800 people. And I would like Oracle to be able to take all of its organic waste to our community learning garden, put it through worms, have it create worm compost, and put that back into the gardens. So I would like to see an entire town be able to support a garden on its waste, because we can sell those worm castings to people who have gardens. So that's one of my projects that I'm working on right now, and it should happen in the next 5 years.
And I'll say that I don't believe in unrealized projects. I have many ideas that, as I said, when I'm making a film, I start approaching material and I try to find myself in it. And I have a long post-it on my computer of film ideas that are unrealized or that I feel aren't realizable. But I always read through that list as I'm in a development phase, as I am now, for new projects, because I always see new entry points into ideas after gaining the experience of making another film. So certainly the experience of making Spaceship Earth will give me new insights as to how I might find myself in new ideas. So I think it's really important to continue to revisit unrealized ideas and to continue looking for ways into them, because I do think that whatever the kernel is of any idea, it's meaningful, and that the connections between these disparate ideas will present themselves over time.
That's a beautiful thought to end on. This has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Matt and Linda and the audience. We would like to thank the Serpentine Committee co-heads, Nina Fialco and Christine Olafstadier, for initiating this collaboration. The committee facilitates the breaking of boundaries, generates discourse, and engages with the urgent issues of today through the medium of film. So we're so grateful to be with you today for the British release of Matt Wolf's film, Spaceship Earth, which so elegantly accomplishes all of this. Thank you to Lady Foster, chair of the Serpentine Council, for being so pivotal in the creation of the film committee, among many other visionary things. To the Serpentine's artistic director, Hans Ulrich Obrist, and our Back to Earth curators, Lucia Petrutucci and Kostas Stantonopoulos. Thank you to Ollie Harbottle and Dogwolf for making this event possible and for hosting us this evening. And thank you to all of you for joining us. The film is available in the UK now on all digital platforms at spaceshipearthfilm.co.uk. And we hope you'll share posts about the film using hashtag Spaceship Earth and @Dogwolf. So thank you, and we hope to see you soon.
Thanks for having us.
Bye. Thank you.